we've been looking at this key scripture for us, looking at the depth of Jesus, who he is, the portraits of Christ. And we started last week with this, Ephesians chapter 3. This is Paul writing to the church of Ephesus, and this was his desire. We said the question is, who is the real Jesus? And so Paul is breaking this down, and he gives us a kind of what I called last week, the faces of love. And Paul kind of shows us Jesus is love. And he says this, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts. So right out of the gates, his desire is that you would know Christ personally. And so if that's the question, who is Jesus? He's saying, here's my desire, is that you would know him. That Christ would be personal to you. He'd be in your heart, in your soul. That you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints. So now he's about to give us 4 faces of love here. What is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth? And to know the love of Christ. So these are 4 measurements of Christ's love for us that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. So one of the things we discussed last week is that anytime you see something listed in 4s, the number 4 in biblical means completeness. And so when Paul says, I want you to be filled with the fullness, I want you to know God completely, I want you to know who Jesus is really, he's saying there's 4 layers to this. There's 4 layers of his love: breadth, length, depth, and height. And so last week, we kind of got Bible nerdy on you. I had a big whiteboard out here, and I showed you all these different times that we see these 4 things. And one of the things that we saw is not only is this 4 faces of love, there's actually 4 images that are found in Ezekiel and in Revelation, 4 portraits that represent the person of Christ. And so in Ezekiel chapter 1, this is a vision that the prophet Ezekiel gets of what it looks like to be in God's presence, what it looks like to be in the presence of God. He goes, and for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face, each had a lion, each had a face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. And in Revelation chapter 4, 7, and 8, it goes on to say these same things. John has a vision, and he sees these same 4 faces. But at the end of Ezekiel chapter 1, he kind of summarizes this vision that he has of the presence, the image, the throne room of God. And this is what he says. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So he goes, in my best effort, this vision, this is how I saw the glory of God. And so we get these 4 images: the face of a man, the face of an eagle, the face of an ox, and the face of a lion. We get these 4 images. In Revelation, John sees the same things. So we got the 4 faces of love from Ephesians, but in Ezekiel and in Revelation, we get these 4 creatures, these 4 images, these 4 faces. And these 4 faces, what Ezekiel says here, they help us to know who God is, who Jesus is. And the first to associate these 4 faces, these 4 layers of love with the Gospels, remember 4 is the number of completion. How many Gospels are there? 4. So the 4 Gospels give us a complete portrait of Christ. And so the first one to kind of tie these things together, you're thinking like, is this a new study? Is this a new thing? No, we're actually pulling on some stuff that was found in AD 130. So just about 180 to 100 years after the resurrection and ascension of Christ, there was a man, a priest by the name of Irenaeus, that he discovered that these 4 portraits, these 4 Gospels are different, but yet they're showing us the same thing. They're giving us different images, different perspectives, but they're revealing who Jesus is really. And if you want to know Jesus, if you want to see him completely, you need to see him through the lens of all 4 Gospels. And although they're different, it's much like music. Like if you got up here and someone played one instrument and hit a note, and someone else hit another instrument, hit a note, and they didn't work together to practice or communicate, it would be clashing. But when multiple people come together and they bring something together that was meant to be together, even though they might be playing different notes, it's portraying one beautiful song. And this is how the Gospels interact with each other. Even though they give us a slightly different portrait of who Jesus is, they're harmonizing beautifully, showing us in completion who the person of Jesus is. So the next 4 weeks, including this week, we're going to kind of dive into these 4 Gospels from an oversight to get a better portrait of Jesus. To answer this question, who is the real Jesus? And so Mark gives us a unique gospel, and that's what we're going to look at today. But each of these gospels were written kind of with a different audience in mind. I don't know if you know this or not, but each gospel was written by a different person, and each person had a specific audience in mind. Mark was writing his gospel to the Romans. Matthew was writing his gospel to the Jews. Luke was writing his gospel to the Greeks. And John was writing his gospel to the Christians, to the new church. And so each of these audiences, if you will, give these guys a little bit different angle. Like if you're telling a story to one person and you walked into a different room to a different person, they had different context, you might tell the same story but adjust how you told it based off of who was listening. And so that's what these guys are doing. And so in Mark, he's telling it to the Romans. And the Romans were strong, they were loyal. They were a people group that valued leadership. They valued action. The Romans were driven by power and by wealth. And so knowing all of this, Mark doesn't start his gospel with the genealogy of Jesus because he knows the genealogy of Jesus is displaying something that the Romans wouldn't appreciate. Because the Romans didn't have any appreciation for the Jews. He didn't start there because all this showed us was that Jesus came from the pedigree of a servant. He came from the pedigree of different people. Yes, there was some royalty in his bloodline, but there's also a lot of brokenness and different things. And so Mark starts his gospel with a different angle to it, and there's a different theme to it because he knows his audience. And so Mark's gospel kind of give you kind of an oversight for it, gives us the portrait of Jesus as the ox, the suffering servant. Mark was written in AD 66 through 70. So if Jesus' birth marks AD 0, we know he lived about 33 years before he was crucified, resurrected, ascended. So this would have been within 25, 30 years of that moment this gospel was written. So one of the ways that we know the Bible is not just a good book, but is a authored book, is a historic book, is a biblically accurate book, is a book we can trust, was because the authorship was so close to the stories when they happened that it couldn't have been stretched or fableized. Like if Mark would have wrote this 300 years later, that story would have passed through one ear, through another ear, through another ear, and you might see, well, okay, the story of Jesus has grown. But the Gospels are from eyewitness accounts. People actually saw it. And Mark is actually not one of the disciples, the 12. It's not that Mark. But he's believed to be one of the 120. So the person and the story of Jesus, he had his 3 closest friends, Peter, James, and John. But then Jesus, as he did ministry, he had his 12 disciples, the apostles that went with him, that studied with him and learned with him. But then outside of that, there was a group of about 120 that went with him everywhere as well. We don't know all their names. We know Mark was one of them. Most theologians believe that Mark was probably a teenager whenever he started following Jesus. So you can imagine, I've got some of my sons here, 15-year-old, 17-year-old son. Imagine like my 15-year-old son come up to me like, hey, this guy named Jesus came to town, healed a bunch of people, preached this message. I'm going with him. And so Mark is just like, he's this teenager that's like excited and following Jesus and learning from a different lens. And so I think this is probably why Mark wrote to the Romans. Wrote this letter to the Romans because he probably, as a teenager growing up under Roman rule, like didn't have the same feeling towards the Romans that maybe some of the older people from his people group, the Jews, did. He saw them as just normal. He grew up around them. They're always there. And so he writes to these people that he had lived with. And so Mark, he writes this gospel, and if you read it in its entirety, you'll see that it's busy and it's short. Like what Matthew and Luke will take time kind of expounding, Mark like just gives you like 2 sentences and moves on. They tell almost identical stories, but Mark is just moving through the story. He's pushing through, showing that Jesus is in this place, and then he's in that place, and then he's coming, and that he's going, and that he goes this direction and goes that direction. And so what you see is that Jesus is kind of always on mission. In fact, Mark uses the word immediately 40 times. Like he's just pushing the story along. In fact, he uses the word, if you're an English teacher, you might not like the book of the gospel or the book of Mark because he writes a ton of run-on sentences. He uses the word and 1,350 times. He just like, every story is like, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And you're like, just put a period and start a new sentence. But that's not how Mark did it, writing it like a teenager, right? And like a young man, like, let's just get this thing out there. So Mark has this different way of telling the story. But even in his way of telling the story, this quick pace, you kind of get this sense of the ox. Like an ox works a field, and an ox, as he plows the ground, he just goes back and forth, back and forth. And the centrality of Mark's gospel is on the deeds of Jesus, like what he's doing more so than the words of Jesus. In fact, the other gospels have more red letters than what Mark does, because Mark is moving us through this story. So let's jump into it. Mark chapter 1, we're going to kind of unpack this idea of ox, Mark, gospel, suffering servant, and the breadth of the love of Jesus. Mark chapter 1, 29 through 31. It says, and immediately, both of those words, he left the synagogue. So Jesus was there in the temple, the synagogue, preaching, and he entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and he took her by the hand, he lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. So really quick in Mark's gospel, we get to the ministry of Jesus. There's not this long discussion about his birth or about his upbringing like we get from Luke, or his birth like we get from Matthew. There's just right into the thrust of the ministry of Jesus, almost as if Mark is saying he's here to serve. Like Mark is saying, like, I want to show you what he's done. And so Jesus, in this story that we see here, he leaves the church, the synagogue where he's doing ministry. Jesus was preaching. There was a crowd gathered, people. He's talking to people, but he leaves this crowd and he goes to the home of Peter's mother-in-law and he heals her. And so I think two things are significant here. One is that we see Jesus leave a crowd. We see him leave the group of people to go and minister to an individual. Jesus has this unique ability as a leader to love both. Like he doesn't chastise the crowds. You see him, he gathers at different times up to 15, 20,000 people are there and he's preaching to them and then he miraculously feeds them. So Jesus doesn't despise the crowd, but he also doesn't despise the individual. Like there's room in the person of Jesus for both parties. He loved them both, the religious people and the wretched people, the Jews and the Gentiles, the men and the women, the young and the old, the rich and the poor. And for some of us today, this is such good news because you've wondered, does Jesus love you? And we see right here in this story, right out of the beginning of Mark, like Jesus is there in both parties. Both of them get his time. Both of them get his ministry. Both of these parties get his service. Jesus is not looking for a better version of you. In fact, I believe that Jesus came and he gave his life to serve even you because he loves you and he cares for you. The true mark of a servant, is that they're always willing to go and to serve anyone at any time. Anyone at any time. So Jesus, he's not distracted by the crowd to the point he doesn't stop to minister to Peter's mother-in-law. Now, it says Peter's mother-in-law has a fever in this, and so I don't know if she was sick, if she was dying, to the extent of that, but even if that was it, how beautiful is that? That a common cold or a fever wouldn't be above Jesus. I mean, it's probably worse than that. Maybe she had a fever for days or weeks. But even if it was just that, how beautiful is that he would stop to serve someone in that moment. But then it goes on in Mark chapter 1. The story doesn't end there. We get another kind of and another push forward. In verse 32, it says, that evening at sundown, so same day, they brought to Jesus all who were sick and oppressed by demons. And the whole city was gathered together at the door. All that were sick, every person in this city was gathered at the door. I don't know about you, but I've been to Target on Black Friday. Have you ever been in one of those lines and you've seen a group of people gathered together at the door trying to get in because they have some certain level of expectation? The difference is you were waiting to get a 32-inch TV that already broke, and these people are trying to get healed. Like, so you think about the expectation we might have on a Black Friday, trying to get in there to get that deal, get that KitchenAid mixer for $25 off that's going to sit under your cabinets for years and get used at Easter and Christmas. Like, well, you guys know what I'm talking about. to get that microwave that's $25, to get that, whatever it is. Like we wait in line, in this line with expectation for what's on the other side of the door, but what's on the other side of the door isn't really that great and grand in the great scheme of things. But these people, they were in line waiting for healing. They were in line having carried something, maybe in their body, a sickness, a brokenness for years, maybe for decades. And on the other side of that door was hope. On the other side of that door was healing. On the other side of that door was compassion. On the other side of that door was a Savior who was willing to get down on our earth, and get into our lives and bring healing to his people. And so when we see this, the whole city, we see a great grand picture of who Jesus is. When Jesus could have easily been entertaining the crowds of royalty, of wealth, and the healthy, he instead is seen serving a crowd of despised and poor and sick. Like this is who Jesus is. He comes to serve. And we don't get to make it through the entire chapter before we again see Jesus faced with a healing proposition. It seems that Jesus is drawn to the people that most of us overlook. It seems as if his serving nature is not based off of what he can get from people, but what he can give to people. Because these people have nothing in return, yet he still keeps pouring out. Mark chapter 1, let's keep going. We're going to stay in Mark 1 for just a little bit. Mark chapter 1, verse 40. And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling down said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. Verse 41. Moved with pity or compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and he touched him. And he said to him, remember he said, if you will, he said, I will. Be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. This is a profound scripture. It's a short, I love how Mark keeps it short for us so I can preach long for you. He gives me space here. Because what Mark says in just these few short words, like really, if you slow down, there's something beautiful here. It says that Jesus was moved with compassion. He's moved with pity on this man. And the next thing he does is he touches him. Leprosy passes through contact. Yet Jesus, in this moment, sees this man and says, I value you, I love you, I see you, I hear you, and he touches him. This man, for at least probably months, years, maybe decades, has not felt the embrace or the touch or the affection of a person through physical means. Yet in this moment, in one interaction with Jesus, all of a sudden he feels something he's been left without. And Jesus not only brings him physical healing, but there is this acceptance, this love, this noticing of someone that has been overlooked and pushed out. And in this culture, in this time, if you had leprosy, you had to stay outside the town. And you were left to the demise of other people's generosity. And if they shared pity with you, they would throw you some change, or they would throw you a sandwich from a distance. But when Jesus shows pity on you, when Jesus is moved to compassion with you, he draws in close, gets in the middle of the mess, touches, brings embrace, brings love, brings compassion, and brings healing to this man. Like Jesus, in this moment, gets in the mess, much like an ox. An ox is not a beautiful animal. An ox is not an animal that most of us have pictures of in our house. An ox is not a pet. It's not something you look forward to touching. Why? Because an ox is dirty, an ox is filthy, and an ox has a job to do. Jesus shows in this moment, I'm not afraid to get dirty. I'm not afraid to touch what you've not been willing to touch. I'm not afraid to love who you've been unwilling to love. I'm not afraid to show compassion, healing to you've been unwilling to show compassion, healing to. And this is a picture, a portrait of the person of Jesus. And all of this happened because Jesus did not come as a king on a horse-drawn chariot, but he came as a suffering servant, as an ox. Jesus came to do the work of the Father. In fact, Jesus at one point says in his ministry, he said, I only came to do what the Father tells me to do. I only came to say what the Father tells me to say. So here he is showing that he's here to serve and submit to the Father's will. And here he is serving this man. And from the very beginning of Mark's gospel, we get this clear picture of the servitude of Jesus. But Jesus pushes beyond just setting an example. And in Mark chapter 10, we get to see Jesus actually confront this with words. His disciples, James and John, were talking and arguing about who's going to get to sit closest to you once we get to heaven. And it was this positional, this prideful, this arrogant conversation, talking about position and placement. And they should have known, they've been around Jesus, that this was not the kind of thing that Jesus would listen to and think kindly of. And so Jesus calls them out. He calls them out in this heart, this positional striving. And so Jesus, but he doesn't just call those two out. He called all the disciples together. It's like, I'm going to make a lesson for all of you because two of you. Don't you hate that when a teacher does that? I know that one kid's been messing up, but now you all have to listen to me gripe for 10 minutes. That's one of my favorite and least favorite things to do as a parent. It's like, now we're here, let's just make a lesson out of this one, okay? Everyone needs to learn this. Let's grow up. Okay, and so this is what Jesus does. He pulls them all together. He says, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you, it will be different. You're not going to be like the rest of the world. That's how leaders operate in the rest of the world. It's how kings operate in the rest of the world. But we're different. Because whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else, willing to serve everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for the many. So Jesus, he shows us something about this ox nature, this suffering servant nature. And so he goes beyond just showing to actually teaching us. And I want to take three things I believe that Jesus is saying about his own ministry, but I believe he's calling these disciples to the same thing, and I think he's calling us to it as well. And this is the first thought for us this morning. Serving is his purpose, but is also ours. He said this, he goes, I didn't come to be served, I came to serve. And if there was anyone who ever walked on the earth that deserved all of us to stop what we're doing and to serve every command of his, every desire of his, every notion of his, that's Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Yet he said, I'm here on mission, and it's not to receive the serving of you, but it's to serve you, actually. And so we get to see that serving is part of the purpose that God has called us to. I mentioned that the ox is not beautiful. In fact, I would say the ox is the least attractive of all the faces. The ox, the eagle, the lion, and the man. If you're going to get a tattoo, you probably not going to get one of an ox, right? It's like it's just a cow with horns. Like, this is not what I want, right? Although me and Ron have been talking about this, we kind of like want one, like right there, big ox, a lion, an eagle, a man, like something like that, something like that. But an ox is not beautiful, right? It's a dirty animal. It's a useful animal, and in fact, it's known more for its function than its majesty. And this is what Jesus is showing us, is like, I came to be known for what I've done, not just who I am. Like, there's something to what I'm doing. I'm not just the Son of God, I'm also the Son of Man. I'm not just the king and the lion of Judah. I'm not just an eagle who soars above, but I'm also an ox who serves the people, who comes and loves the people. Serving is not popular, it's not normal, it's not natural, but it is eternal. And it's what Christ is calling his disciples to. When everyone else in the world is trying to be served, the challenge for us as Christians is to be called to serve. It's an upside down kingdom that we've been invited into. And it's so easy to get caught up into this, to think that if I'm going to do something of significant, I need to be above people. I need to make more than them. I need to have a title, need to have a position. And our world is so driven to more and title and narcissism and our name and all these things. I mean, social media, the whole idea was created so I can talk and you listen. I mean, the whole idea of it is that. And so we have this thrust of narcissism and elevation of ourselves. And so what Jesus is saying is not simple. He's saying, I want you to go against the grain of the entire rest of the world, to prefer others over yourself, So serving is not just something we do at the park. It's not just something you do on a Sunday. Serving is a purpose. It's a mission. It's the thing that we've been called to do. And I think for some of us, we get this misconception that serving is something I sign up to do at a moment. When Jesus says, though, serving is a mission. Serving is a purpose. In fact, some of us in life struggle to find purpose and fulfillment because we think purpose and fulfillment is other people serving us, when we're actually wired the opposite. Now, we're taught that's how we find purpose, but that's not how God wired us. And here's how I know this. I've been given some great gifts as a kid at Christmas. I remember one year when my dad got me a four-wheeler. My mom and dad got me a four-wheeler. It was awesome. I thought I was like 14, 15 years old. I thought I had a driver's license and I could just go anywhere I wanted. I mean, it was that kind of freedom. And I would get on it and I'd be gone for a couple hours. I'd drive that thing down dirt roads, go to a gas station, get a Gatorade like I was like the stuff. I was like the Fonz leaning up against a Corvette or something. It's like, man, look at me and my four-wheeler. It was a great gift. I remember that four-wheeler. I love that four-wheeler. But all of that pales into comparison in the few moments I've had giving my kids or my wife something intentional and something special, something that I knew that they would love. All of a sudden, I start to realize there's purpose inside of generosity. That God has actually wired us to be people to find fulfillment as we help other people find their purpose and fulfillment. That God has actually wired us from the onset of time to be a little backwards, but our culture has perversed it, broken it, changed it to make us think that more is the goal when actually less is. And serving is a mission, it's a purpose, it's part of who we're called to be, not just something we sign up to do at the Boys and Girls Club on the weekend. Now, should you sign up to serve at the Boys and Girls? Yes. Should you sign up to serve at VMA? Yes, we need you. We're launching 3 services in the fall, if you haven't heard. We need some more people to jump into what we're doing, the mission that God's called us to. But I'm telling you, it goes beyond just a sign up. It's part of who we are. It's our purpose. Some of you are missing your purpose in life because you're not doing anything for anyone else. That's where purpose is found. And Jesus goes on to, I think, show us this, is that serving is the first step to leadership. It's the first step to leadership. Leadership is not being in charge, dictating orders, sitting back, drinking lemonade, watching everyone else doing the work. Leadership is serving the people who are serving the mission, serving the people who are serving the purpose, serving the people who are serving the vision. Think about this. The ox is humble and gentle, yet he is strong and capable. Serving others doesn't put you beneath them, contrary to what the world might tell you. Being the strongest or most capable or highest paid person in the room should not elevate you. In fact, it should elevate others. As believers, when we are given strength, when we are given gifting, when we are given position, it should not just elevate us. In fact, the mark of a Christian should be that anything that we get benefits others. Not just in our generosity, but in our leadership, in our servitude. And this is what the ox does. The ox is given immense strength. In fact, it was basically the industry standard of a John Deere tractor back in biblical times. It was strong, it could harvest, it could plow the ground, it could do all these things, yet it was gentle and humble. If God has given you a gift, the question for us is, how are you using that to serve others? How is your elevation elevating others? And this is what we see, what the ox does. He takes his strength, yet he uses it with meekness and humility. You know, Tuesday, our entire staff comes together and works part-time, full-time. Anyone who's on our staff, we all work together all day Tuesday. And so Tuesdays, a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, a lot of decisions, things like that. It's a busy day. Volunteers come in. We got some great admin ladies who serve. They come in and do things. They put together our kids' curriculums. And if you've ever gotten a postcard that said, thank you for attending VIMA, if you're new, it was from one of our ladies who come in. They hand out those cards. They pray over you. They pray over our Connect cards. We've got a great group of ladies who serve in that capacity in the middle of the week. It's super cool. Tuesday's just a busy day. And so if you were to ask me, John, what do you get done on Tuesday? I would tell you nothing. In fact, if I marked the success of Tuesday by me accomplishing the things on my list, Tuesdays would be an utter failure. I never get anything done on Tuesdays. My door, doesn't matter if I close my door, if my door's open. There's people everywhere. There's kids everywhere. It's this big mess, and it's awesome. Lots of fun things. But the purpose of Tuesday is not for me to do my work. The purpose of Tuesdays is for me to serve the people doing the work. And so as a leader, I've recognized, in fact, Tuesdays, they don't work for me. I work for them. So on Sunday, our staff, they may be here executing the vision or mission or things that we've discussed, but on Tuesdays, I'm asking them, how can I help you? How can I resource you? What are the questions that you need answered that help you to do what you've been called to do better? And so I think for us, like, we've got to get this perspective that maybe by elevating the other people around us, it actually has some sort of God-type way in the upside-down kingdom to elevate ourselves. But as we elevate ourselves, maybe we're actually hurting the people around us. So how are we serving those around us? Maybe even in this, consider this. Have you ever considered how you serve in your marriage? Maybe the way that your marriage is going to get better isn't by you telling your spouse what they could do better, but by you looking at yourself and going, how can I serve you? Maybe maybe the thing that your kids need from you isn't just telling them where they messed up or how they could do better, but looking at them and trying to find a way to do something that shows that you love them and to serve them. Maybe the way to get your boss or your employees or the people around you to do a better job is to show your appreciation and to serve them. Maybe, just maybe, the world isn't here to carry our calling and deliver our dreams, but maybe we're here for the world, to serve it. So then the last one for us, serving comes at a cost. Jesus said in Mark 10:45, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The ox is unique because it serves sacrificially through suffering. The ox was recognized as the animal who patiently labored for his owner. He was strong, able to bear heavy burdens. The ox pulls the plow through the hardest of soils, breaking up the ground, making a way where there was no way. The ox carries the burden, and he does the work that no one else can do so that others can receive and benefit from the fruit that no one else can provide. This is the ox. Matthew 11:28. This is what Jesus says about himself. Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. See, some of us are missing this portrait of Jesus, this perspective of Jesus, part of the personality of Jesus as the ox, the suffering servant, because in our lives, it's our job to carry our burdens. We've been carrying it all alone, been doing life all alone. We've been plowing the ground all alone. If something messes up, I got to fix it. If my marriage is in trouble, I got to do this. If my kids this, I got to do this. If I need to make some more money, I need to work some more hours. And so we put all the pressure and all the weight and all the burden of the whole world on our shoulders. And what happens is we're crushed under the weight of what we were never meant to carry. We were never meant to carry the weight of the world. We were never meant to carry the weight of provision for our family. We were never meant to carry the full weight of salvation or grace or mercy. We were never meant to carry the weight of the full weight of our marriage or our kids. Like Jesus says this, he goes, those of you who are weary and been carrying a heavy burden, bring it to me. I'm the ox. I've been designed to carry the weight. My purpose is to carry the weight. I serve you by carrying the weight. And in fact, Isaiah prophesied this. He says, surely Jesus, he's bore our griefs and he's carried our sorrows. The prophet Isaiah is talking about Jesus on the cross, carrying the weight of humanity and sin and brokenness. In Hebrews, it says this, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. You see, by Jesus, we're called sheep. Sheep are not beasts of burdens. Sheep don't carry weight. They don't pull. They aren't strong. In fact, Paul says this. He goes, I boast in my weakness. I'm not strong. So as a sheep, you can look in the mirror and go, that's not my gifting. That's not who I am. I'm not strong. They don't carry burdens. The burden carrying is for the ox. The ox is an animal that gives in his life and he gives in his death. The ox plows his entire life in service to the master. But once his life and his plowing time is over, he's slaughtered and he continues to give in provision. The ox serves and serves and serves, and then in the end turns into beef smoked ribs. You knew I was going to work food in there somewhere. I mean, think about it. The ox, the eagle doesn't do that. Man doesn't do that. Lions don't do that. The ox does. The ox is a unique image. It's a unique creature. It's a unique portrait of Jesus because we see that the ox is serving and the ox is sacrificing. The ox gives all that he has in service and ultimately in his life. In Ephesians chapter 2, the first verse that we read, Paul says that there's 4 faces of love. There's 4 layers of love. And what he talks about is the breadth, the width. If you're ever measuring something, you're talking about, I don't know if you've ever done this, but like I go to measure something with my hand and try to walk to the next room, like holding your hands in the same spot. Like, okay, that's about that. Have you ever done that? You measure with your hands. It's about that wide. It's just about exactly that wide. That's what I say. Just about exactly. Me and my son Jaden, he might not remember this, but when he was like 3 or 4 years old, he would come up to me at night and sometimes in the morning before preschool and stuff, and he would ask me a question. He would say, "Dad," and he would use his little kid voice, "Do you love me?" W. "Do you love me this much?" And he'd put his hands like this. I'd say, "No, don't." "Dad, do you love me this much?" "Nope, don't. No, that's not how much I love you." "Dad, do you love me this much?" "No, son, that's not how much I love you." "Dad, do you love me this much?" And then I would say, "Yes." I'd pick him up, turn him upside down, do all the things dads do. Shake him. My wife's like, "Stop, leave them alone. They just ate." All the things dads do, right? Love them, squeeze them, throw them on the floor, wrestle with them, like trying to show, like, I love you this much. And we think about the love of Jesus, it's very similar. We measure it by breadth, right? We measure it by width. That's how we measure the love of Jesus. And the ox is the only animal that serves his whole life, plows, breaks the ground that you can't break, carries the weight that you can't carry, does the work that you can't do. But in the end, when the serving time is over, he spreads his arms and says, "I love you this much." And they nailed him to the cross, and he gave his life not just in service, but in sacrifice. He says, "I'm not just going to do good things for you. I'm not just going to show you that I love you by serving you and healing you like the leper and Peter's mother-in-law. I'm not just going to do good things, but I'm going to give my life so that you can be free, so that you can be saved, so that you can be healed." The ox is the only one that does that through his serving and his sacrifice. He loves you this much. And Jesus told the disciples this 3 times in the book of Mark, 8:31, 9:31, and 10:34. Jesus began to teach them. He said this, "The Son of Man must suffer many things." The suffering servant. "He'll be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and he will be killed, and after 3 days rise again." You see, the ox is the only animal on the faces of Christ that gives himself in life and death, in service and in sacrifice. You see, Jesus, he did the work that we cannot do. He paid the price that we cannot pay because he loves us more than you know. This is Jesus. He is the suffering servant who has given his life to show you that he loves you. How much does he love you? This much.